The gravel crunched under the tires of the moving truck, a sound that should have been satisfying, a signal of a new beginning. To me, it was just noise, another unwelcome intrusion into the quiet I so desperately craved. I'd bought the cabin on Whisperwind Lake for silence, for the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the sigh of wind through the pines. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to heal, a place where the ghosts of my past might finally be laid to rest. My wife, Clara, had been the vibrant, living embodiment of everything I loved about the water. She'd have adored this place, with its rustic, unpretentious charm and the wide, welcoming expanse of the lake that mirrored the sky. I could picture her on the small, weathered dock, her feet dangling in the cool water, a contented smile on her face. But Clara was gone, taken by a slow, cruel sickness that had stolen her from me piece by painful piece, leaving behind a hollow echo in the spaces she once filled. The silence in our sprawling suburban home had transformed from a peaceful backdrop to a suffocating presence, each empty room a fresh, visceral reminder of my loss. The scent of her perfume lingering in the closet, the half-finished book on her nightstand, they were daggers to the heart. So I sold it all, the house, the furniture, the life we had built. I packed up the remnants of our years together, the tangible memories that were both a comfort and a torment, and headed north, seeking solace in the raw, untamed solitude of the mountains. The cabin was perfect, exactly as the pictures had promised. It was small, but not cramped, built of sturdy, time-silvered logs. Inside, a massive fieldstone fireplace dominated the main room, promising warmth against the chill of mountain nights. But the real jewel was the porch, a wide, covered space that overlooked the water, offering a panoramic view of the lake and the forested hills beyond. The property itself was large, a sprawling tract of land that included a significant portion of the lakefront, a dense stand of old-growth pines, and the only functioning boat ramp for miles around. It was this last feature, a simple concrete slab sloping into the water, that would become the unlikely catalyst for a war I never wanted to fight. A war against an enemy I hadn't yet met. Adjacent to my property, separated by a line of neatly planted but distinctly artificial-looking shrubs, was a small, exclusive community of homes called Azure Springs. It was an HOA, of course, a collection of pristine, oversized houses with perfectly manicured lawns and a set of rules thicker than a phone book. I'd been vaguely aware of its existence when I bought the cabin, but I'd paid it little mind. My property was not part of the HOA, a fact that had been made explicitly, unequivocally clear in the sale documents, a point my lawyer had emphasized with a satisfied tap of his pen. I was a free man, beholden to no one's petty regulations. Or so I thought. I was wrestling a particularly heavy box of books out of the back of the truck, my muscles straining, when I first saw her. She was standing on the edge of her immaculate lawn, a perfectly coiffed woman in crisp white linen, her face set in a permanent look of stern disapproval. She watched me with the unblinking intensity of a hawk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to physically contain her disdain. I offered a tentative wave, a universal gesture of neighborly goodwill. She did not return it. Her expression remained unchanged, her gaze unwavering. An hour later, as the movers were carefully maneuvering my worn leather armchair through the cabin door, she marched across her lawn and onto my property without a hint of hesitation. A thick, leather-bound binder was clutched in her hand, like a weapon. She was, I would soon learn, Karen, the president of the Azure Springs Homeowners Association, a woman who wielded her perceived power with the precision of a surgeon and the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice as sharp and brittle as breaking glass. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Karen, the president of the Azure Springs Homeowners Association. She announced her title as if it were a royal decree. Michael, I said, wiping a sweaty palm on my jeans and extending a hand. She stared at it for a moment, a flicker of disgust in her eyes, before pointedly ignoring it. I'm sure you'll want to familiarize yourself with our community guidelines, she said, thrusting the binder at me. It was heavy, its pages filled with dense, single-spaced text. We have certain standards here at Azure Springs, standards that I'm sure you'll be eager to uphold. It's what keeps our property values high. I took the binder, bewildered. My mind, already foggy with grief and exhaustion, struggled to process the encounter. I'm not part of the HOA, I said, trying to hand it back. My property isn't in Azure Springs. A flicker of something, annoyance, disbelief, crossed her face, quickly replaced by a mask of condescending pity. That's a common misconception, she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. All properties bordering the lake are subject to our rules. It's for the good of the community, you understand. We can't have just anyone moving in and, well, lowering property values. Her eyes flickered over the dusty moving truck, the stacks of cardboard boxes, and my own disheveled appearance. I was tired. I was grieving. I was in no mood for a fight. The will to argue simply wasn't in me. I'll take a look at it, I said, my voice flat, setting the binder on a stack of boxes. But I'm pretty sure my lawyer said I'm not in the HOA. Your lawyer is mistaken, she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for debate. I'll be back tomorrow to discuss the matter further. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you'd move that truck. It's an eyesore. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and marched back to her perfect house, leaving me standing in a sea of my own unpacked life, a profound sense of unease settling over me. I had come to the lake seeking peace, but I had a sinking feeling I had just met the architect of its destruction. The next morning, I was woken not by the gentle sounds of the lake or the chirping of birds, but by the sharp, insistent rap of a police officer's knuckles on my door. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and opened it to find a young deputy standing on my porch. His expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes held a hint of weariness. Behind him, standing just on the edge of my property, was Karen, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had her arms crossed again, a general in her command tent, observing the success of her latest tactical maneuver. "Sir," the deputy said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm Deputy Miller. I'm responding to a call about a possible squatter on this property." I stared at him, dumbfounded. The word squatter seemed so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. "A squatter? I just bought this place. I moved in yesterday." "That's what he says," Karen called out from her perch on the lawn, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "But he has no proof of ownership. For all we know, he could be a drifter, a transient. This is a respectable community." Deputy Miller shot her a look that was a master class in controlled exasperation. He turned back to me. "Do you have any paperwork, sir? A deed, a bill of sale, anything with your name and this address on it?" I was still in my pajamas, my mind foggy with sleep and now reeling from the accusation. "Yeah, of course, it's in one of these boxes." I gestured vaguely at the mountain of cardboard that filled the living room, a chaotic landscape of my life in transit. "I'll wait," he said, his voice patient, though I could see him mentally steeling himself. It took me a frantic, sweat-inducing 20 minutes to find the right box. My hands were shaking as I tore through packing tape and bubble wrap, the rustling plastic sounding like thunder in the quiet cabin. I tossed aside photo albums, kitchen utensils, and stacks of Clara's favorite novels, a fresh wave of grief washing over me at the sight of her familiar handwriting on a bookmark. Finally, buried at the bottom of a box labeled Office Important, I located the folder with the closing documents. I snatched them up and handed them to Miller, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He examined them carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration, comparing the legal description to the address. Karen watched the entire exchange with hawk-like intensity, her smug smile slowly beginning to falter. "Everything seems to be in order," he said finally, handing the papers back to me. He turned to face Karen, his voice now laced with an unmistakable edge of authority. "Ma'am, this man is the legal owner of this property. There's no reason for us to be here." Karen's face fell, her triumphant expression crumbling into a mask of petulant indignation. But the truck," she stammered, grasping at straws. "And all the boxes on the porch. It's all so untidy." "He's moving in, ma'am," Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That's what people do when they move into a new house. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual police work to do." He gave me a quick, apologetic nod, a silent acknowledgement of the ridiculousness of the situation, and walked back to his patrol car. Karen stood on the lawn for a moment longer, her face a mask of pure fury, before turning and stalking back to her pristine house, the crunch of her shoes on the gravel path sounding like an angry retreat. I closed the door, my heart still racing. The incident had left me shaken, a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I had come to the lake for peace, but it seemed I had stumbled into a war zone, and I had a feeling the first battle had just been fought. The moving day standoff was just the opening salvo. Karen, it seemed, was not one to be easily deterred. In the days and weeks that followed, she launched a campaign of harassment that was as relentless as it was petty, a death-by-a-thousand-cuts strategy designed to wear me down. It started with the letters. Official-looking envelopes, embossed with the gold leaf Azure Springs HOA logo, began appearing in my mailbox with unnerving regularity. They were violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. The deep forest green of my canoe was apparently not in keeping with the community's approved color palette. The placement of my barbecue grill on the back patio was an unapproved modification to the property's exterior. My wind chimes, a simple bamboo set that Clara had loved, their gentle clinking a sound I found deeply comforting, were cited as a noise nuisance. I ignored them, of course. I knew they were baseless, that she had no authority over me. I used them as kindling for my fireplace. But they were a constant nagging reminder of her presence, a steady drip of poison into the peaceful life I was so desperately trying to build. She didn't stop at letters. She began to rally her troops, encouraging other HOA members to join her crusade. I'd see them, clustered on her perfectly manicured lawn, their hushed whispers and pointed fingers following me as I worked in my yard or carried groceries from my car. They'd drive by my house, slowing down to a crawl to stare, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and manufactured contempt. I was the outsider, the rebel, the man who dared to defy the self-proclaimed queen of Azure Springs. The final straw, the act that pushed me from passive resistance to active warfare, came in the form of a surveyor. I was out on the lake, finally finding a moment of genuine peace in my canoe, the water like glass, when I saw him. He was a man with a tripod and a measuring tape, methodically walking the perimeter of my property. And Karen was with him, of course, pointing and gesturing with an air of great importance, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. I paddled back to shore, my arms pulling through the water with powerful, angry strokes. My blood was boiling. "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice tight with a fury I hadn't felt in years. "Just a routine property survey," Karen said, her voice as smooth as polished silk. "We have reason to believe that the property line is not where you think it is. It's a very old plot, you see. We suspect a portion of this land, including that very convenient boat ramp, may actually belong to the HOA. I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed across the water. "You're delusional," I said. "I have the deed. I have the official survey from the sale. This is my property." "We'll see about that," she said, a smug, confident smile playing on her lips. "The law is the law." The survey, however, did not go as she had planned. In fact, it backfired spectacularly. It not only confirmed that my property line was exactly where my deed, and the previous survey said it was, but it also revealed a rather inconvenient and delicious truth for the HOA. Their meticulously landscaped community garden, a source of immense pride for Karen and her followers, and the winner of the Azure Springs Garden of the Year award 3 years running, was, in fact, almost entirely on my property. I stood there, the surveyor's official report in my hand, a slow, angry smile spreading across my face. It felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Karen's face was a picture of slack-jawed disbelief, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "It seems you've made a mistake," I said, my voice dripping with a sarcasm I didn't bother to conceal. "A rather large, flower-filled, award-winning mistake." That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought every single "no trespassing" and "private property" sign they had in stock. I spent the rest of the day hammering them into the ground along the newly confirmed property line. Each satisfying thud of the hammer, a release of my pent-up frustration. I placed them every 10 feet, an unambiguous, unmissable metal and wood declaration. "This is my land. Stay off." I put a particularly large one right at the entrance to the boat ramp. The signs, of course, caused an immediate uproar. The HOA members, who had been using my boat ramp for years as if it were their own personal marina, were suddenly cut off from their beloved lake. They were a class of people used to a certain level of entitlement, a sense of ownership over the entire shoreline. The idea that their access was a privilege, not a right, was a bitter pill to swallow. They came as a group that evening, a small, angry mob marching down the road, their faces contorted with outrage. They stood on the edge of my property, just beyond the line of new signs, their voices raised in a chorus of indignant complaint. "You can't do this!" One of them, a man with a face the color of a ripe tomato, shouted. "We have a right to use that ramp. We've been using it for 20 years. "No, you don't," I said, my voice calm but firm, my newfound resolve a suit of armor. "You have been trespassing on my property for years. I was willing to overlook it, to be a good neighbor, but your president, Karen, has made it abundantly clear that she has no interest in being a good neighbor. So, the free ride is over." They grumbled and protested, throwing out phrases like "community spirit" and "un-American." But they knew I was right. They had no legal claim to my land. They were at my mercy, and they didn't like it one bit. The next day, a letter arrived via courier from the HOA's lawyer. It was a cease and desist order, 5 pages of dense legal jargon and empty threats. It demanded that I remove the signs and immediately restore the HOA's access to the boat ramp, or face swift and severe legal action. I knew then that I couldn't fight this alone. I was out of my depth, a grieving veteran trying to build a new life, not a seasoned legal warrior. I needed help. I needed a professional. I found Sarah online. Her website described her as a lawyer who specialized in property law and HOA disputes, with a reputation for being sharp, no nonsense, and fiercely protective of her clients. The testimonials were glowing. I called her office and made an appointment for the next day. As I drove to her office in the small town nearby, a sense of hope, the first I'd felt in weeks, began to bloom in my chest. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an ally, a champion, and together we were going to take down the Queen of Azure Springs. The town hall meeting was a circus. The room buzzed with tension, a palpable current of animosity crackling in the air. It was packed to the rafters, a sea of anxious, angry faces. On one side sat the residents of Azure Springs, a united front of entitlement and indignation, whispering amongst themselves and casting hostile glares in my direction. On the other side sat a handful of my supporters, the gruff but friendly owner of the local hardware store, a few other independent property owners from around the lake, and a couple who had had their own run-ins with Karen. We were a small but determined group. Karen, of course, was in her element. She stood at the podium, a picture of polished corporate professionalism, and delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of manipulation and half-truths. She painted me as an uncooperative, antisocial outsider, a troublemaker who had come to disrupt the peace and harmony of their idyllic community. She spoke of tradition, of the decades of shared access to the lake, of the aggressive and unneighborly act of putting up those awful signs. She even shed a crocodile tear when she spoke of the children who could no longer easily go for a swim. She was good, I had to admit. She was very, very good. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, the stack of violation letters and the surveyor's report in my hand. My hands were trembling slightly, but as I looked out at the crowd, I saw Sarah give me a reassuring nod from the front row. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice quiet but clear, amplified by the microphone. I didn't try to match Karen's emotional theatrics. I just told the truth. I told them about the harassment, the baseless violations, the constant feeling of being watched. I told them about Karen showing up on my first day and declaring my lawyer mistaken. I told them about being woken up by a police officer, accused of being a squatter in my own home. I held up the surveyor's report. I told them about their award-winning community garden that was, and always had been, on my property. I presented the facts calmly and rationally, one after another, without the emotional flourishes that had characterized Karen's speech. When I was finished, a hush fell over the room. For the first time, the residents of Azure Springs were hearing the full story, my side of it, and it was clear that it was not what they had been led to believe. You could see the doubt creeping into their faces. Then, something unexpected and wonderful happened. An elderly woman, a resident of Azure Springs whom I had never seen before, slowly pushed herself to her feet. Her voice was frail, but her words were as strong as steel. "He's telling the truth," the woman said, pointing a trembling but steady finger at Karen. "My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was one of the first people to build a home in Azure Springs. This woman," she said, her voice gaining strength, "has been a bully for years. She has used the HOA as her own personal kingdom, to intimidate and harass anyone who dares to cross her. She tried to have my son's perfectly legal shed torn down because she didn't like the color. She fined the family next door because their son's wheelchair ramp wasn't in the original plans. I've lived in Azure Springs for 20 years, and I've seen it time and time again. This man is not the problem. She is." A murmur went through the crowd. Other residents began to nod in agreement, their faces a mixture of relief and newfound courage. It was as if a dam had broken, and years of pent-up resentment and fear were finally being released. Then Sarah stood up. She walked to the podium with a calm, confident stride, a single yellowed sheet of paper in her hand. "I have here," she said, her voice ringing with authority, silencing the room, "a certified copy of the original deed to Mr. Henderson's property, dating back to 1952. It contains a covenant, a legally binding agreement, that explicitly states that the owner of this property, and only the owner, shall have sole and exclusive control over the lake access, including the boat ramp. The Azure Springs HOA has no legal claim to that ramp. They never have." The room erupted. The residents of Azure Springs turned on Karen, their faces a mixture of raw anger and betrayal. Her carefully constructed empire had crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. The town council, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so dramatically and decisively, had no choice but to publicly affirm my property rights. The war was over. I had won. The fallout from the town hall meeting was swift and decisive. The HOA board, facing a full-blown rebellion from its members, called an emergency meeting. Karen, stripped of her power and her credibility, was forced to resign as president. The Queen had been dethroned. A few days later, a small delegation from Azure Springs appeared at my door. It was the newly elected HOA president, a mild-mannered, apologetic man named George, and a few other residents. They were holding a peace offering, a freshly baked apple pie. "Mr. Henderson," George said, his voice sincere and his eyes full of regret, "we've come to apologize. We were wrong. We let Karen manipulate us. We listened to gossip instead of facts, and we treated you unfairly. There's no excuse for it. We'd like to make amends." I was taken aback. I had expected more fighting, more resentment. But it seemed the residents of Azure Springs, free from their tyrant, were ready for a change. "We were hoping," George continued, looking genuinely hopeful, "that we could work out some kind of formal agreement for lake access. We're willing to pay an annual fee, of course, to help with the maintenance and upkeep of the ramp, and we'll draft and agree to a strict code of conduct. No more late-night parties, no more loud music, just quiet, respectful use of the lake that we all love." I looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse in their eyes. I had won the war, but I had no desire to be a tyrant. I had come to the lake for peace, and that meant finding a way to live in harmony with my neighbors. "I think we can work something out," I said, and for the first time in a long time, a genuine smile spread across my face. We drew up a formal agreement with Sarah's help. It was fair and reasonable, protecting my rights while still allowing the residents of Azure Springs to enjoy the lake. The no trespassing signs came down, replaced by a single, professionally made sign that read, "Azure Springs Community Access Point. By permission only." Months later, as I sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I felt a sense of profound peace that I had not felt in years. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was a comforting, healing embrace. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a part of me, a quiet reminder of the love I had lost and the strength I had found in its wake. I had come to the lake seeking solitude, but I had found something more. I had found a community, a sense of purpose. I had fought a battle I never wanted, and in doing so, I had not only protected my own peace, but had inadvertently brought a new era of cooperation and respect to the shores of Whisperwind Lake. I had honored Clara's memory not by hiding from the world, but by building a life of quiet strength, a life I had fought for and won. And as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving a sky full of stars, I knew, with a certainty that filled my soul, that I was finally home.